Hello, everyone. My name is Lena Dobrowolska, and I am one of the co-coordinators of the Ways of Repair, Loss and Damage program. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the third day of the Ways of Repair symposium, which will see a keynote presentation with Dr. Farhana Sultana, who will present her essay, Decolonizing Climate Knowledge, Repairing Epistemic Injustice and Loss in the Era of Climate Change. This essay was developed as part of the Texts of Repair Commission. And I just like to say thank you so much, Farhana, for being with us today.
Thank you.
For those joining us for the first time, Ways of Repair is a year-long artistic research program engaging with the issue of climate-related loss and damage. Ways of Repair is part of the Loss and Damage Collaboration's Art and Cultural Program and has been supported by the Open Society Foundations. Our program includes an online artistic research residency, the commissioning of critical text, and a series of public events, all aimed at facilitating a transdisciplinary exchange on the loss and damage caused by the climate crisis. You can find all of our previous events and activities archived on our website, waysofrepair.com. The Ways of Repair Symposium marks the culmination of our program. It will showcase the work developed by the artists in residence and critical thinkers over the past year and is taking place now over these 2 weeks from January 20th to 29th on Zoom. In this first week, we will see the presentations by the artists in residence, Zara Malkani, Nombuso Matibele, and Sibonello Gumede, and Gabriela de Matos, as well as the keynotes by the critical thinkers. We saw a presentation by TJ Demos on Monday and Alexis Pauline Gums yesterday, and today we have a pleasure to hear Farhana's, and they will be presenting the texts of repair developed as part of the Critical Writing Commission. Next week, we will see the themed panel discussions during which the artists in residence, commissioned critical thinkers, activists and other experts will explore the critical links between the loss and damage discourse and the corresponding diverse and ever-evolving themes within the arts and humanities. These discussions will address responses to the combined climate, human rights, and environmental crisis, while emphasizing the necessity for decolonization and reparative forms of practice. If you haven't already signed up, you can find the registration links for each session on our webpage, which is now being shared in the chat. We also encourage you to visit our website to explore the digital restitutions by our artists in residence, as well as the critical texts, which are being published on the day of the presentation. Before I properly introduce our esteemed speaker, I would like to share a couple of housekeeping rules. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you are tuning in from, and share your thoughts on today's topic. Please note that you will be ejected from the session for any abusive comments. In order to ask a question, please type into the Q&A box anytime during the presentation or Q&A. You can still modify your question after posting it. The plan for today is to have approximately 45-50-minute presentation by Farhana, followed by a 15 minutes Q&A. The session will be recorded and the recording will be shared on the symposium's webpage on our website, as well as on our YouTube channel shortly after this presentation. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce today's speaker, Dr. Farhana Sultana, who is an interdisciplinary scholar, speaker, and author who is broadly interested in the nature-society relationships, political ecology, climate justice, water governance, critical development studies, transnational feminist scholarship, human rights and citizenship, and decolonizing global systems. She is a professor of geography and the environment at Syracuse University, where she is also research director for environmental collaboration and conflicts in the program for the advancement of research on conflict and collaboration at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She is also a visiting fellow at the International Center for Climate Change and Development at Independent University, Bangladesh. Dr. Farhana's recent publications include Confronting Climate Coloniality, Decolonizing Pathways for Climate Justice, Decolonizing Climate Coloniality, Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility, The Unbearable Heaviness of Climate Coloniality, and Resplendent Careful Climate Revolutions, as well as Water Politics, Governments, Justice, and the Rights to Water. In her text, Decolonizing Climate Knowledge, Repairing Epistemic Injustice and Loss in the Era of Climate Change that you're about to hear, Farhana draws attention through the lens of climate coloniality to how, although loss and damage is now central to climate change discussions, these discussions often focus on the physical and economic impacts on vulnerable populations at the risk of overlooking the epistemic dimensions of loss, the erasure of knowledge, silencing of voices, and denial of participation for those from the Global South and indigenous communities in climate governance and knowledge production. Her essay serves as a compelling roadmap for confronting climate coloniality enmeshed in climate knowledge and governance by emphasizing the importance of centering marginalized voices and embracing pluriversal ways of knowing to reimagine and create truly climate just futures. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Farhana. We are incredibly grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, those of you who've joined us from near and far. I really want to thank the Ways of Repair Loss and Damage program for inviting me to be part of the program for the last year and to deliver this text of repair. I'm particularly grateful to Theo, Lena, and Phoebe Lynn, who have made this program possible and have shepherded it through to many, many talks and outputs. So let me first, I'd just like to share some slides, if you don't mind, just so that I can give you some visuals to go with what I will be talking about. So as you know, that when we think about these issues around loss and damage or climate coloniality, my hope is that it makes sense in terms of how do we think about, think about the ways we can confront these issues. So I'll be drawing from some of the ongoing issues that's happening globally, but then also to set it in context of what we can do about all of this. So many of you know that climate change is often called a risk and threat multiplier, exacerbating inequities and injustices through more intense, frequent, and unpredictable weather and ecological events. Given these growing ecological crises and climate-fueled disasters, the global consensus is rising to confront systems that perpetuate and exacerbate such impacts. These images that I'm showing you surely are familiar. But as I've demonstrated, specifically in my recent book that came out a couple of months ago, climate coloniality disrupts any simplistic approaches to pursuing climate justice. As a critical framework for understanding the contemporary climate crisis, climate coloniality refers to the entanglement of colonial legacies with contemporary climate change, emphasizing how global power structures born out of colonialism continue to shape the uneven impacts of climate change. Climate coloniality reveals how legacies of imperial violence insidiously live on, not only in environmental degradations and climate-fueled disasters experienced by variously marginalized populations, primarily indigenous or in the global south, but increasingly everywhere. But also what is known and the climate impacts and the solutions advanced to address these problems. Colonial legacies have maintained the matrix of power from colonial and imperial times in both subtle and overt ways into the present, thereby complicating climate politics at both global and local scales. So we know that loss and damage has become a third pillar of discussions on climate change after mitigation and adaptation. Loss and damage are now central to climate change discussions, but these often focus on physical or economic impacts on vulnerable populations. Excuse me. This can overlook the epistemic dimensions of loss, which means the erasure of knowledge, silencing of voices, and denial of participation of those from variously marginalized and silenced communities, primarily amongst indigenous populations and many communities across the global south. In many ways, the epistemic loss reflect an enduring colonial structure that not only shapes the uneven distribution of climate impacts, but also determines who can speak and whose knowledge counts in global climate governance. Epistemic silencing turns into epistemic violence and erasure of knowledge and expertise in the discourses around climate. The assumptions, methods, and imagined solutions to climate injustice are thus incomplete, resulting in even more losses and damages. The current climate crisis isn't just producing losses and damages materially, culturally, ecologically, and economically. In much more insidious and long-standing ways, it is causing harm in the production and circulation of knowledge, access to opportunities, having a voice and being heard or heeded, influencing policymaking and decision-making around climate, and changing the trajectories and lived realities of many on the ground. We know that voice is power, but who has voice and whose voice is deemed worthy? These are all entangled with climate coloniality. To emphasize a reparative approach away from these losses and damages, I argue that we need to decolonize how we understand climate justice and the knowledge production around climate change to begin with. The ongoing systemic and structural problem is not just a matter of representation, if that's where your mind is going, but it also reflects the power dynamics and biases embedded in current climate policymaking and project formulation processes. These biases favor certain forms of knowledge, for instance, technical and what is considered scientific, and certain groups of people, for instance, experts and elites, while marginalizing others, such as indigenous and local voices. These processes also favor certain policy solutions, primarily technological and market-based, while neglecting other forms of solutions, such as community-based and rights-based. These biases have real-world consequences as they shape the direction of climate policies and their impacts on people and the planet. It becomes imperative to counter the centuries of dominant framings that produced the current crises by centering and listening to indigenous voices and global South expertise. We can thereby tackle in more meaningful and more robust ways the limitations of our understandings, working towards a more complete picture of the different outcomes and alternative understandings of impacts often hidden in greenwashed narrative. These also enable us to prepare ourselves with more comprehensive knowledge and frameworks to tackle climate and ecological crises, both ongoing and forthcoming. Epistemic injustice is a significant yet often overlooked form of climate injustice, as I hope I will make clear today. This exclusion of Indigenous and Global South voices, knowledge systems, and expertise from international climate forums, climate framings, and pathways is a loss, not just for those directly impacted, but for all of humanity. Colonial silencing continues to impoverish global responses to the climate crisis, perpetuating a climate coloniality that privileges often global North, Eurocentric, technical, capitalist, and market-based perspectives while marginalizing any other alternative or making them seem implausible. So in this text, what I do is critically examine the role of power, pedagogy, and praxis in climate change knowledge production. Drawing on insights from a range of scholars across Indigenous and Global South communities, I argue for the urgent need to decolonize the institutions that govern climate science and climate policy. By decolonizing knowledge, we can address the multiple layers of epistemic injustice that undergird the climate crisis. That means that maintains it, that reveals it in some ways but hides it in other ways. But in this process, By peeling through these multiple layers, we can reevaluate the systems through which knowledge is produced and which knowledge is valued, and thereby create alternative spaces for alternativist epistemologies that have long been ignored or devalued, but which are likely very valuable. Ultimately, this text calls for a fundamental rethinking of how knowledge about climate change is created, shared, and used, centering the voices and expertise of those who are most affected by it, but least empowered to shape its trajectory. So what is climate coloniality and epistemic injustice, you might be wondering? So epistemic injustice refers to the systemic devaluation or exclusion of certain voices and knowledge systems. In the context of climate change, this manifests in the marginalization of indigenous ecological knowledge and global south or local epistemologies about human-environment relationships. These knowledge systems, often developed over centuries to manage local environments sustainably, are not only ignored and undervalued in international climate negotiations dominated by Western scientific and market-based approaches, they end up reinforcing the dominance of global North interests and continue to marginalize those most affected by climate change. So the silencing has a lot of consequences. Moreover, the exclusion of global South and indigenous voices, especially those that stress alternative solutions from climate governance and policymaking that perpetuate narrow technocratic solutions that fail to address the root causes, we can start to think about, well, what are these problems? What are these solutions? So for instance, solutions such as carbon markets, geoengineering, and large-scale infrastructure projects are often promoted at the expense of more holistic, community-centered approaches that prioritize care, relationality, mutual aid, and local knowledge. Epistemic coloniality results from the asymmetric power relations embedded in knowledge production and dissemination, which perpetuate these dominant Western epistemologies and marginalize and subjugate other ways of knowing and being in the world. It encompasses how colonial structures and ideologies continue to shape knowledge systems, privileging certain forms of knowledge while silencing, devaluing, and erasing others. Thinking about coloniality of knowledge and how Eurocentric power matrices endure globally still, it isn't surprising then that knowledge solutions and policymaking around climate change are rooted in knowledge structures and power relations that privilege more powerful, hegemonic, colonial, and Eurocentric ways of knowing. As a result, the ongoing exclusion and unhearing are not incidental, but structurally embedded in global governance systems, thereby perpetuating the epistemic violence of climate coloniality. Today, this epistemic violence is maintained by structural barriers to participation and deplatforming, as well as the marginalization of non-Western knowledge systems in climate policy and what is deemed climate science. The continuing invisibilization of Indigenous and Global South knowledge is a form of loss and damage that not only affects those communities, but the whole entire global community and the planet we live on. For instance, issues around access to venues for critical debate and agenda setting, such as the Conference of Parties on Climate Change, such as the COPs, in addition to issues such as visa restrictions and hassles, travel costs, and lack of easy aero mobilities for many from Global South countries and Indigenous communities, are repeatedly raised as concerns, as barriers to sharing knowledge. These are structural barriers that maintain the losses and damages due to epistemic exclusion from planning or policy setting spaces. And this has been centuries in the making. This did not just suddenly happen in recent decades. People from around the world and across Indigenous communities have made clear their concerns and critiques about global climate change, about climate policymaking, the power relations involved, the narratives of domination and control, and what is often overlooked. Yet these critiques and commentaries are largely overlooked, and they're not integrated into mainstream climate conversations or actions. They're occasionally spotlighted. But we know that justice-oriented decision-making and agenda-setting actors need to have access to a variety of knowledges from across the world in order to make more robust policies, more robust designs in how to proceed. They need to know how to listen and how to hear what the message is. Wider availability of alternative knowledge systems and approaches makes possible more comprehensive information and framings to tackle ongoing climate and ecological crises. Critical support of such efforts can enrich knowledge bases and repertoires and provide accessible information without the need for moderation or reinterpretation, so that listeners, all of us, can sit with the information, ruminate, analyze, and go back to learn more from other sources and in other ways. Decolonizing educational systems and expanding transdisciplinary knowledge can help foster critical skills development to shift the needle in order to help this along. This can involve, amongst other things, improving awareness of the workings of power and power relations spatially and temporally, practicing the art of deep and reflexive listening, bearing witness to and valuing diverse and inclusive forms of knowledge systems, and pluriversality. These are not the only essential ways for decolonizing minds in pedagogy, but they help us towards recentering Indigenous and Global South voices and perspectives and re-envision a better and more convivial future for humans and more than human species. So to demonstrate my points in my text, I weave in narratives from a project called Voices from the Global South, a series of short documentaries produced by the Open University, the Royal Geographical Society, and the International Geographical Union that feature experts and activists from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Bangladesh, Chile, Fiji, Nepal, South Africa, and Uganda. Through the case studies in each country, the contributors clearly and poignantly demonstrate the need to confront climate coloniality, to decolonize climate discourses, to address climate justice and injustice understandings, to value Indigenous and local knowledge, to practice deep listening, to understand learning to unlearn and relearn, and to showcase what engagement with wider public scholarship and art could advance. While I use these case studies as exemplars of existing debates and critiques, countless other examples from across the globe can substantiate the concerns that are discussed here. Starting with speeches and visuals from the annual Conference of Parties on Climate Change held in Scotland in 2021, or the COP26, the films traverse the globe to capture critiques and counter-narratives from across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, often called the post-colonial world or the Global South, and Indigenous communities globally in both the Global North and the Global South. These demonstrate how Western science and Eurocentric knowledge that went global with European colonization has long-standing legacies, resulting in dominant narratives still emerging from the Global North, or what is often called the former colonial and contemporary imperial seats of power and sites of control over discourses, decision-making, material outcomes, and finances by countries, corporations, and elites. While terms such as Global North and Global South have complex and contested meanings and are often used as heuristic devices, they are nonetheless marked by historical differences. So flipping the world map encourages us to think critically about these legacies of colonialism, stratification, and hierarchy, such that the Global South figures more prominently in the way we visualize the world, as you can see in this flipped map. So I want to first talk about the first of the three main themes that my text goes into, which is power and voice in climate spaces. Considering the workings of power and voice, climate change discourses are dominated by global North countries' interests and expertise. This is well documented. But we know that standpoint and positionality matter, as do contextual knowledge and more expansive geographical framings. So this ongoing hegemony is a hindrance to more fruitful and equitable futures. The contributors featured in the project Voices from the Global South highlight what is overlooked by those from more powerful, advanced, industrialized countries and decision makers, such as inequitable impacts of climate change, unequal access to opportunities to speak and to be heard, and the power relations that influence climate policymaking and framings, having to deal with ongoing impacts of colonialism and skewed development politics and outcomes, as well as having to face various biases in media coverage and discursive framings, along with a plethora of concerns that need wider attention. The films and the speakers contained therein challenge how climate change and crises are narrated and understood. In other words, dominant narratives are now open to challenge and change, but this requires the ability to first recognize the problem and a recommitment to re-educate us and those around us, enhance our pedagogies and praxis, and decolonize our knowledge systems about climate change. In these 6 films, we see various workings of power, critiques of a range of power relations, and how complex the impacts of injustices are and their knock-on effects. We hear from different voices across different locations about not only the need to change dominant narratives and support equitable voices, but also how difficult it is to speak truth to power. The global climate conferences offer a glimpse of the wider political economy of power and voice at different scales and spaces. There are vast inequities built into these systems that govern what can be said, what is debated, and what ultimately is decided about climate change. How we understand its interconnected impacts, what is highlighted in media and discussions, and then the actions that should be pursued. So what we learn is that voice and access to opportunities to have a voice does matter, but so does being heard and listened to. The barriers to participation in international climate forums or other decision-making spaces are numerous and deeply entrenched. Activists and scholars from across the Global South and Indigenous communities frequently face difficulties in attending such spaces due to lack of financial resources, accreditation, simultaneous webcasts or media coverage of events, coverage in multiple languages, and deplatforming at critical moments. So for instance, even when they are able to be present, their voices are often marginalized, as illustrated by the stark power imbalances in venues such as the COP. And this ends up producing chronic gaps in knowledge and policy, thereby reproducing hegemonic or dominant narratives, which are often influenced by fossil fuel corporations and powerful states. But there are additional forms of silencing, such as access to the mic, being cut off from the mic, being barred from these conferences or from certain rooms, be denied an audience, or speaking to an empty room. This was addressed by Indigenous activist India Logan Riley from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and climate scientist Dr. Salim ul Haq from Bangladesh in their respective films. So for instance, renowned scientific journal Nature called Dr. Salim ul Haq a climate revolutionary and one of the top 10 most important people to help shape climate science in 2022. But when he spoke at COP26, world leaders couldn't be bothered to show up. The empty room that you see in this photo serves as a metaphor for the epistemic void in climate governance, a space where knowledge of the most vulnerable is rendered invisible, and the experts who have come to tell us about it are unheard. Chronically ignoring a range of voices means disproportionate impacts and burden of climate injustices occur not only in long-term exposure to different hazards and vulnerabilities, but also from the devaluation of expertise of various communities who have learned how to deal with them. The inequities in climate change policymaking and governance thus have serious implications on the ground. Global South countries not having power and influence over climate change policy debates leads to chronic underrepresentation in all contexts, from policymaking to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but then also in negotiating power in bilateral and multilateral trade relations and so on. However, international gatherings, oddly enough, do offer opportunities for networking and creating new solidarities, to share and be heard, to build kinship and alliances. They could, with proper support, help to create more equitable and justice-oriented outcomes for the world's marginalized population facing the brunt of the climate crisis that they did not create. Dr. Salim al-Haq points out that for LDCs, which are least developed countries, these climate conferences, such as the COP, are nonetheless important, as the only place they at least have a seat at the table, unlike the G7, where powerful countries and corporations make rules and negotiation in closed spaces where others are not invited. In these films, the case studies from Bangladesh and Nepal also show how local voices remain excluded from dominant global narratives and planning at great cost to local peoples and ecosystems. For instance, the historical colonial era strategies of displacement and marginalization of indigenous people are recurring in new conservation projects in Nepal. These fortress conservation have led to dispossession of ancestral lands and has diminished indigenous practices worldwide. In the case study from South Africa, intersections of race and class are influencing how different communities in the same urban area experience climate change. Social inequity and climate vulnerability persist in townships, which are a holdover from the colonial apartheid system, where marginalized people are facing severe water crisis and heat stress. So again, we can see these multiple knock-on effects in different places. So this brings me to the second issue around Indigenous voices. When we think about epistemic loss, it is also evident in how stories of impacted communities are translated and appropriated in global forums. Often, the nuanced and deeply complex historical knowledge and histories of Indigenous and Global South communities are repackaged into depoliticized narratives that fit technocratic frameworks. For example, Indigenous peoples' resistance against extractive industries and climate-related displacement is frequently framed as environmental activism, rather than as struggles for sovereignty, self-determination, and survival. Such framing downplays the potential and political dimensions of these struggles, marginalizing the broader calls for justice that are central to them. Regarding the exclusion of oppressed groups, specifically non-male, non-white, and non-academic sources of climate and ecological wisdom, Indigenous scholars have highlighted how coloniality has not only perpetuated certain framings and explanations, but also produced biased knowledge that is in turn universalized. It is critically important to understand the tensions between Western science and Indigenous science as disparate ways of knowing and being in the world. The colonial epistemicide against Indigenous science has been ongoing for centuries. Eurocentric hegemony has marginalized and othered incompatible knowledge systems, thus limiting the ability to even question who has the right to produce climate knowledge. While Indigenous knowledge systems are excluded from hegemonic climate discourses and practices, they contain many important existing cosmologies of decolonial knowledge and resistance that center on accountable, reciprocal, and ethical relations and processes. And boy, do we need more of that today. If we want to decolonize our knowledge and our institutions, we must create alternative forms of epistemic justice. This includes valuing and fostering other epistemological knowledges and methodologies, promoting different knowledge holders and experts. The universality of Eurocentric models enforced across the world has resulted in the capitalist colonialist crisis of climate breakdown. It is time to unlearn so that we can relearn differently, to conceptualize and practice the just and justice-oriented futures that we want. In the films that focus on Indigenous voices in these set of documentaries, the case studies from Chile and Aboriginal Australia underline the importance of combining Western and Indigenous knowledge equitably and reflexively to avoid the continued extraction or theft of Indigenous and local knowledge around the world. Indigenous climate justice teaches us more expansively about interconnectivity and relationality. Climate justice is not about the separation of nature and society, but about people and communities being part of climate change. Decolonization is thus about not only the ontology and epistemology, but understanding how methodology is central to both. The films showcase storytelling as an Indigenous methodology for relationality and knowledge sharing. In Aboriginal Australia, countermapping and renaming are methodologies being used to challenge the colonial power of maps that impose certain normative controls across the world through colonial cartography. Similarly, in Chile, Indigenous analyses exposed how green transition is exacerbating ecological extraction and destructive practices in the country's lithium mines. The case studies from Fiji and New Zealand showcase the importance of interrogating the colonial roots of climate change, especially the ways Indigenous knowledge is included or excluded. Colonial legacies of inequities and hierarchies of knowledge systems, alongside persistent hierarchies of power relations, ensure that differences and injustices are maintained across different sectors and scales. By confronting coloniality and the structures that maintain and create and recreate these knowledge hierarchies of expertise and value, we can see the impacts of colonial domination repeating itself across the globe. For instance, Pacific Islander expert Steve Ratuva from Fiji highlights the role of colonialism, multiple narratives, and the importance of paying attention to nuances. These nuances and elements are lost in the grand universalizing narratives of climate and ecological solutionism that often come from hegemonic elite discourses around climate, from corporations, and from global North governments. Inclusive learnings from a wide range of voices means learning from and practicing what is known as deep listening and relearning. This means approaching Indigenous and local knowledge to decolonize dominant narratives and framings about climate change. Indigenous collaborations are essentials, as pointed out by several contributors, such as Tracy Bunda from Aboriginal Australia. Thus, paying attention to Indigenous cosmologies helps to challenge the universality of Eurocentric knowledge production, and it can help foster pluriversal ways of knowing and doing in addressing climate crises in more robust and pluriversal ways. Learning from Indigenous knowledge helps us address the climate crisis by changing, enriching, and complementing and challenging Western science, and it reinforces the need to reevaluate systems of knowledge production, dissemination, and absorption. These are important components to challenge extractive knowledge practices and understand how issues are often framed to conceal extraction, exploitation, and injustice. We all only want to hear positive stories, right? This is why things are often hidden. But Indigenous knowledge and Western science can be combined. But this necessitates working relationally and reflexively with Indigenous and Global South scholars, scientists, leaders, activists, and communities. This is part of what decolonization demands. So this brings me to power and praxis. So we know that power operates both materially and discursively in legitimizing and delegitimizing what knowledge and whose knowledge counts. Certain voices, concerns, issues, and framings are rendered invisible, illegible, or devalued in different ways. The workings of power are demonstrated poignantly throughout the films of the Voices of the Global South, but also across various media commentary, group conversations, and various opportunities across the world. But to shake up conversations around climate change and to challenge ongoing destructive and extractive trends and realities, we need to have various forms of uncomfortable conversations. These uncomfortable conversations need to be had, heard, and shared. Climate justice must be about historically underrepresented peoples, about alternative framings of discourses, and inclusion of voices that account for differential power relations. It is about much more than greenhouse gas emissions. If we are to seriously decolonize climate and halt this runaway train wreck, this hurtling disaster, we must be able to name the problems and then identify more inclusive ways that injustices can be tackled. Collaboration is essential, but so is speaking up when necessary. But at the same time, decentering ourselves so that we may create spaces for and listen to voices that have historically ignored, sidelined, marginalized, or else only tokenistically included or paid lip service to. And here I use the word we about those of us who have relational privilege in the world, those of us who have the opportunity to have education, a voice, access to platforms. So when we start to do these different things, we can start the process to redress the losses and damages from epistemic injustice. I argue that it is a privilege to hear and learn from the voices across Global South and Indigenous communities, from their scientists, academics, activists, farmers, workers, fisher folk, artisans, artists, and more. Reckoning with climate mentalities and dominant framings across pedagogy and praxis is essential for more expansive and inclusive thinking and action. Greater efforts on this front are desperately needed to course correct runaway climate and ecological crises. What these films and other documents and collaborations encourage is greater public scholarship to promote engagement with critical and transdisciplinary knowledge systems and various forms of scholarship that have been sidelined, because these help us address climate injustices and climate coloniality. Intentionally heeding a wide range of voices requires a willingness to do so. Similarly, as many communities across the world have demonstrated, collectivizing to have their concerns and suggestions and be voiced and heard can result in change, even if it takes continual and exhausting commitment to do so. For instance, Dr. Salimul Haq poignantly pointed out before he passed away a little over a year ago that the Fund for Climate Loss and Damage came through about only because of concerted, long-standing efforts from vulnerable communities. It just did not get added because few people demanded it. It was being demanded for over 20 years. In many ways, for such actions to be fruitful requires those with privilege to silence themselves, create space for other voices to be included and heard in a practice of relational privilege. It is about questioning our conventional wisdom, the unquestioned science, and the notions of equity. It is not about discarding everything we know, but it is about discarding the thought we think we know everything. We need to open our minds and make space for different and more inclusive knowledge, to expand our thinking and ally with others in their journeys. This can mean quieting those dominant narratives and those who have continued to benefit from privileged voice and material access to power and decision-making. Creating space through concerted, intentional action can result in disrupting the status quo, whether through protesting and demanding government action on climate commitments or calling attention to the dangers of quick fix solutionism that sacrifices more at the altar of climate breakdown. So in conclusion, what I want to argue is that we know that the climate crisis is both perpetuated and produced by colonialist and capitalist practices that extract resources, exploit labor, and marginalize non-Western knowledge systems. As countless examples have highlighted over decades, it is imperative to be aware of the epistemic injustices and structures of exclusion and to hold institutions, narratives, and framings to account. It is possible to inclusively engage with various voices and perspectives, challenge how powerful decision makers listen to and evaluate proposals, use our privilege toward recentering marginalized voices that are re-envisioning convivial futures already, and configure how we ethically engage in interdisciplinary and international collaborations. The work of decolonizing climate knowledge and governance requires a fundamental rethinking of how we understand and respond to the climate crisis. It is not enough to simply include more voices in climate discussions. This must also challenge the power structures that determine whose knowledge is valued and whose expertise is recognized. Epistemic injustice is a form of loss and damage that compounds the material impacts of climate change. Thereby, addressing it is essential to achieving real and meaningful climate justice and reparations. But this involves redefining power relations so that epistemic justice can exist to begin with. It means we must decolonize our minds and educate ourselves away from systems that result in runaway unsustainability and those that value profit and destruction in the name of eternal growth and progress on a finite planet. Choosing to ignore alternative knowledge overlooks more holistic outcomes that would benefit all of us. The imperative to decolonize knowledge production surrounding climate change has never been more urgent. As droughts, wildfires, floods, cyclones, glacial melt, and rising sea levels continue to escalate. Conversations and narratives about climate issues are often dominated by groups and sectors with similar interests and backgrounds, neglecting those from around the world who have long endured the impacts of climate devastations, but possess invaluable place-based knowledge and diverse paradigms. The trend of whitewashing climate discourses and intellectual spaces is increasingly drawing criticism, and rightly so. So we therefore need to contribute to a broader dialogue on a range of issues. Decolonizing climate discussions, therefore, necessitates addressing the complexities of ongoing colonial legacies inherent in the global governance structures we now have, the discursive framings we normalize, and the visions for the future that we assume are best for all. This endeavor calls for ongoing reflexivity, deep listening, a commitment to standing with others, to speak with and not for, and to create inclusive and reparative spaces that elevate the importance of Indigenous and Global South epistemologies, voices, and expertise. Lastly, we know the messages and clarion calls from around the world are powerfully demonstrating what it means to confront climate coloniality. We just have to pay attention. They invite us to unlearn to relearn, and to learn from a range of voices in our assessments and understanding of our world. They also present us with unique opportunities to disrupt preconceived notions or received wisdom, especially about climate change, power structures, knowledge production, pedagogy, and public scholarship. It is possible to envision alternative possibilities that are collectively co-created to support transformative planetary justice goals. A collective reimagining to better futures is essential. We need to embody hope while being acutely aware of the challenges we face, ensuring that hope is grounded in reality and not mere platitudes. Let our curiosity, wonder, collaboration, celebration, abundance, and conviviality guide us. Hope is born from action, so let us act collectively. Thank you so much for listening. You can access this text on the Ways of Repair website, and many of my publications are accessible from my website, which is literally my name, farhanasultana.com. And thank you all again for listening to this talk.
Thank you so much, Farhana. That was absolutely epic. As most of your talks and your writing, and it really asks to just sit with it for a while. But as Farhana said, this text is open access. It's available via our website, and we are so happy that we were able to support you in developing this piece of writing. We had lots of questions, as you can imagine, and I encourage everyone, again, I guess, to sit with this text. So I will be filtering through the questions a little bit, because I think some questions you actually provide very clear answers to those in the text. So I will prioritize questions which really allow us to elaborate a little bit and expand. So I just wanted to start with a question from Samira Sadiq, which I think will be really close to your heart, because Farhana is not just a thinker and a philosopher, but also a very hardworking academic who is a pedagogue. And the question is about how to, first of all, thank you for this talk. Can you speak to how to decolonize academic institutions, universities, which are centers for producing climate knowledge? And I would like to weave it in with my question of, when you say about reimagining the spaces or creating different alternative spaces for alternative epistemologies, how do you see those? How do you imagine those, and how marginalized groups can participating in designing those and contributing to this new system?
All right. Well, thank you both for those questions. They're complex and they require long conversations, but I'll try to keep it a little bit brief. So when we think about decolonizing academic institutions, especially universities and research think tanks, where which are the centers in producing climate knowledge, what I've argued for many years in other publications, and what do we mean when we talk about decolonizing universities, is we really do need to address the institutional structures. We need to challenge the way knowledge is produced in terms of which knowledge is taught, which is prioritized, which kinds of voices are continually cited, invited to speak, who is being taught in the classroom. So for instance, and this is a statement that was made by a well-known anthropologist about 40 or 50 years ago. She said, you can find somebody reading a bad translation of Shakespeare in the Tibetan plateau, rather than people reading their own history. That's what I mean by Eurocentric knowledge that has gone global. Why are people in the deltas of the world, in the plateaus of the world, in the jungles of the world reading bad translations of Shakespeare, rather than understanding their own local histories, cosmologies, ecological knowledge, praxis, which is like theoretical and practice-based learning that requires deep reflection and then action. So a lot of this comes from various philosophers, whether it's Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire or Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci. So there are a lot of different scholars who have argued that we need to be able to not just assume knowledge for knowledge's sake, but where was it produced? How was it produced? How is it circulated? Where is it going? So when we want to decolonize institutions that produce certain hegemonic knowledge, that straitjacket us into this, because don't forget, how did we get to this climate crisis? It was a certain form of knowledge and desire and economic modeling and understanding of progress that fueled the Industrial Revolution, of certain forms of race science, eugenics that fueled colonization, certain forms of devaluing knowledge in other groups of people that's perpetuating, for instance, whether it's European or American imperialism for 500 years. So when we think about these issues in institutions in any country, if we're remodeling the same forms of knowledge production, we're silencing and invisibilizing other knowers and experts. So to think about how do we decolonize academic systems and institutions, it has to be multi-pronged. It starts with the classroom. I think I agree with Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, who said, the classroom is the last radical site of politics. It is where we teach. So teachers have enormous influence and power in shaping the curriculum to the extent that they can. So what we teach influences what is learned, right? So it's a generational issue, but it's also about challenging institutions in terms of, boards of trustees and donors that control what happens in terms of what is taught. So for instance, in the United States, talking about climate or teaching about issues about racism or exclusion have been really silenced. And it's getting worse. So how do you operate in these interstices, in these gaps? We have to learn to operate in the margins, in the silent spaces, in the ways. So you have to create more elbow room. You have to create more fissures in the systems that seem overwhelming. And the only way you do that is through collectivizing. You have to collectivize. We have to have people power. We have to have solidarities that value care and care ethics and that relationality, because you can't do this alone. No one person can do this. It's groups and multiple groups, and it takes time. So that's one quick and very simplified answer to Samira's question. And to Lena's question about reimagining alternative epistemologies. It is, part of it is detailed in the text in terms of learning to read other theories, other cosmologies, sitting with different speakers. So for instance, one of the speakers in the Voices from the Global South, Tracy Bunda from Aboriginal Australia, she talks about what it means to combine Western climate science modeling and Indigenous Aboriginal knowledge about weathering, about climate, about, relationships to, territory, because that is home, that is your territory as kin. And it's a beautiful way of really blowing open your mind. So therefore you're creating it's oxygenation of your own mind, of your own brain, in teaching it to think and learn and absorb knowledge differently, and to sit with that injustice, sit with that discomfort, and recognize that you're uncomfortable now, but you're teaching yourself to be more powerful in figuring out how to ally with other people, to be accomplices, and not just fake allies, but be really, arm to arm accomplices who help push the needle forward. I'll leave it at that.
That's all fantastic and really thought provoking. But questions are just keep coming. But I've got a question from Lynn Fitzner, which reads, considering the increasing dynamism in international climate litigation, what role do you believe international courts and tribunals can play in addressing epistemic injustice? And how can we enhance international law's understanding of Indigenous knowledge on climate change in particular?
All right. Okay, great question. Thank you. I hope I followed it. I'm trying to hear and take notes, and we're keeping to the multiple parts of the questions. So international courts and tribunals, and in terms of international law, they're important, they're great, but sometimes they don't necessarily have the implementing or enforcing capacity. So we've known that young people, young climate groups, the children have sued their governments domestically and internationally. These have been brought up in the media and in news coverage. Usually domestic laws are the ones that local communities can grapple with. For international laws in addressing epistemic injustice, I think what would be really important is seeing how can international laws and spaces of international dialogue help advance um, more understanding or a wider understanding of what law is. So Indigenous law is very different from European law, right? But if we look at the international, ICC or ICJ, what kind of law systems are they based on? So there will be some overlap, but there will be some difference. And I think creating more spaces for the different types of law and justice to be understood so it's more accessible to more people is one way to think about repairing some of those epistemic injustices in legal frameworks. And I think that's really important as well. But at the same time, who are the lawmakers and who are the law enforcers, I think are important to think about because we know that there are different ways that things endure, that coloniality and the matrix of power endures, whether it's through institutionals or legal frameworks or international discourses or trade agreements and so on, right? It's everywhere. So I think we need to be able to think about the ways we can think about different laws and how they can be adapted and interpreted locally and whether it makes sense. And what are the different types of justice? Are they thinking about recognition or reparative or distributive? There are many, many different kinds of justices, right? But often it's just the bare recognition where, just to be able to hear and to be seen, to have a voice being heard is often where people are stuck. Forget the distributive and the reparative justice, those come later. It's that unhearing that's being enforced through that matrix of power. It is the invisibilizing that has endured. And so first we need to confront those issues, I think.
Mm. Thank you very much, Farhana. I'm just going to attempt two more questions because we're slightly over time, but there were so many, so I'm just trying to do as many as possible. Jose Manuel Mojica asked a question about the climate policies and planning in the Global South reproduces decisions made from the Global North or from international meetings. If pluriverse is essentially local, how do we face the tensions between global and local? So I guess it also speaks to your idea of nuance and pluriversality versus universalism.
Right. So that global local tension exists everywhere, right? So it is about the looking for nuance, seeking it out, and that requires knowing how to do it. So this is what I mean by power and praxis and pedagogy. So it is about learning and doing and shifting those power structures. So if we want to think about how a local is often subsumed, it has that Eurocentric knowledge and practices have gone global. There's a sort of form of colonization of minds that is enforced through education from a very early age, through media, through Hollywood, and so on. It is a big challenge, but it is entirely possible, and we're seeing it happen. We're seeing more and more people figuring out, recovering. A lot of it is recovering those voices. It is about reconstituting. It is seeking nuance. It is thinking about what are the pluriversal ways of knowing instead of just the universal hegemonic juggernaut way of existing in the world, because we've been all conditioned to do that. It's taken me a lifetime to be able to speak I guess, loudly for many, many years. I wouldn't be saying these things, let's say, when I was, in college, because I didn't have the vocabulary and the tools. I was trained in a sort of specific way. I had to be educated differently. I had to then unlearn myself and then relearn, re-educate myself. And that, therefore, anyone can do this. Anyone can do this. You just have to engage. You have to make yourself do it. And as instructors and teachers, or as activists, or as journalists, we all can help each other on this journey. I said, you can't do this alone, but the thing that is in your power is to self-educate. That is the one thing we control. What we read, what we consume, what we pay as pay attention to. So if we're looking for those global, local nuances, we need to recognize that most of us have been taught to kind of understand accept a certain form of global discourse, global epistemology. And we need to shift away from that if we want to repair these epistemic injustices and figure out better solutions to, how do we address ongoing massive losses and damages and climate injustices.
Thank you so much for this answer. And there was another question, I'm not going to ask it, but it really spoke to what you said by Nadir Ruzman, who was asking about southern person with a northern mindset or vice versa. So, reflecting about this coloniality with, so yeah, you spoke to that as well. I just wanted to acknowledge. I've got the last closing, wrapping up question, which I think is fantastic, by just lost it. Patel Adarva. Could you share your thoughts on the significance of reparations as both a concept and a practice? Additionally, how do you see its relationship with loss and damage and the decolonization of climate justice?
All right. Okay. Big question. So I'll try to answer very quickly in the interest of time. So what I've tried to do in this talk and in the text is think about reparations, not conceptually, but also epistemologically, but arguing that it is a practice, but it leads to other forms of practice of reparations in terms of addressing loss and damage. So if we don't understand what are the different types of loss and damage, we are going to only think about the economic losses and damages, right? Rather than the more epistemological, the knowledge-based losses and damages, which is what I'm trying to highlight in my work. At the same time, therefore, that therefore limits what we then can go on to claim as climate justice or as reparations. So it is not just the material reparations, which are incredibly important for frontline communities, but it is also recognizing how did they become those frontline communities, and what kinds of knowledges are we losing in the loss of those frontline communities, because we've lost so much over time. And I think one of the ways we can think about it as both concept and practice is that praxis. In my world, there is no just practice, there's praxis. Praxis means practice that is theoretically informed and always critically reflexive. It is recursive. It is a critical interrogation of what is done in the name of practice, what is learned in the name of theory, and how those things are linked. What is the method or methodology being pursued? So as both a scholar and I guess a scholar activist, and also as somebody who is, works really hard to make things as clear as I can to people, but at the same time, making sure that what I say has a relevance in academia, otherwise there won't be uptake, and I cannot shift the needle in terms of academic shifting that needs to happen. So it's what we need to, I think all of us need to do is speak in multiple tongues, to speak to different audiences. So who are we speaking with? When do we need to silence, unlearn, and just hear? And then when do we need to speak, right? And how does that shift our own praxis? And we keep educating ourselves. That's that lifelong praxis. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Farhana, for such a generous just contribution and for such a nourishing talk on this really, really urgent topic. And I encourage everyone to to read the text again, because it's very rich, and I probably need to read it a couple more times to fully take it in. But again, thank you so much for taking on the commission and for following the program and contributing to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, all the everyone in the audience, and especially everyone with the amazing questions. I will note them down and I will think hard about them, and feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to me via email, on social media, and so on. But do read the text and watch this video again if it helps. But I'm happy to answer more questions later. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to everyone. Just to very quickly say that thank you for this session. Thank you for being so active in the chat and with posing your questions. For those who have not already signed up for our next sessions, please head to our website to find the sign up link for the remaining sessions. We will have Farhana back with us on January 29th. for a themed panel discussion, Decolonizing Climate, Coloniality and Recentering Marginalized Voices and Knowledges. And it will be an interdisciplinary panel with architect, urban planner, researcher, and professor and curator Gabriela de Matos, and a founder and executive director of Climate Refugees, Amali Tower, which will consider why, in the context of loss and damage, a fundamental rethink of how climate knowledge is created, shared, and used is needed into one that centers the voices and expertise of those who have been most impacted by the climate crisis, and yet they are the least empowered to shape its trajectory. Some of the focus points will be feminist research, Afro-Brazilian architecture, examined through an intersectional lens of race, culture, and environmental justice, climate-induced migration and displacement, and the urgent need to decolonize the climate governance and climate science. So I really welcome you to that. In terms of tomorrow, we will see multidisciplinary artist Zara Malkani presenting her artist research project, A Ubiquitous Witness, which explores musical and oral traditions that bring together devotion and dissent, poetry and protest as form of remembrance and resistance against environmental devastation, dispossession, and erasure. And I will encourage you to look at Zara's digital restitution on her website as a good introduction to this talk. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and we wish you a very good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.